"He's dead," the man said, and he didn't even have the decency to look sorry about it. Clara Whitmore stood in the middle of Dust Hollow, with her one bag at her feet, and the stagecoach already pulling away behind her, and she heard those two words, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not grief, not relief, but pure, cold terror. Because she had come here to marry a man she had never met, had traveled 4 days to do it, had told herself it didn't matter that she didn't love him, that safety was enough, that a roof and a name were sufficient reasons to hand a stranger her entire life. And now there was no stranger, no roof, no name. There was just her, alone, in a town that was already looking at her the way towns looked at women who arrived without anyone to belong to. Subscribe right now and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had rehearsed the fear for 4 days on the stagecoach. She had sat in the rocking, lurching interior and gone through it the way a person goes through something they know is coming and cannot stop, methodically, grimly, with the particular discipline of a woman who had learned early that feelings not examined in advance arrived with more force than feelings that had been handled. She had thought about the man, about the night, about what it meant to owe someone your presence in a room you could not leave. She had been afraid of a great many things in her 23 years. She had been afraid in the specific way of a woman who knew exactly what she was walking into and had no alternative to walking into it. She had not thought to be afraid of this the stagecoach leaving before she finished reading the situation. The bag at her feet. The street of Dust Hollow, Colorado, stretching out in both directions, full of strangers who had already clocked her the way a town clocked an unattached woman, and were arriving at conclusions she could not correct fast enough. The man who had told her Harold Beecham was dead was named Aldous Pruitt. He was Harold Beecham's business partner, a fact he conveyed with the practiced efficiency of a man who had delivered bad news before and had learned to deliver it quickly so he could get to the next part of the conversation. He was compact, 50-ish, and had the quality of a man whose hands were always doing the arithmetic of a room. "When did he die?" Clara asked. 3 weeks ago, Pruitt said. "Fever. 3 weeks ago." She had been in transit for 4 days. The letter arranging the marriage had taken 2 weeks to reach her in Abilene, which meant Harold Beecham had been dead before the letter even arrived, which meant she had been traveling toward a dead man for 4 days without anyone thinking to send a correction. "Was there no way to reach me?" she said. Pruitt had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "We didn't know where you were coming from," he said. Beecham handled the arrangement personally. "We knew a woman was coming. We didn't know much else." A woman was coming. Not Clara Whitmore. Not a person with a name and a past and a 4-day journey behind her. A woman. "I see," she said. "There's a boarding house," Pruitt said, pointing down the main street. "Mrs. Haverford runs it. She's decent." He paused. The pause had something in it she didn't like, a kind of calculation, an opening of a door he was considering walking through. "Of course, Harold's situation being what it is, there's the question of what you intended to live on. Since the arrangement was, as you say, personal, there was no financial—" "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll find Mrs. Haverford." She picked up her bag. She walked away from Aldous Pruitt before he finished the sentence, which was, she had learned the most efficient way to end conversations with men who were building to something you didn't want to hear. She walked down the main street of Dust Hollow with her bag and her face composed, and the distinct sensation of walls closing in on her from 3 directions, and she thought, "I have $11.40. I have no arrangement. I have no person in this town who knows me, and I have nowhere to go back to because what I left in Abilene was worse than this." She walked into the boarding house. Mrs. Haverford was a woman of 60, who looked at Clara with the experienced eye of a woman who had been running a boarding house long enough to read the situation of every person who walked through the door inside of 10 seconds. She looked at Clara's bag, her face, her hands the set of her shoulders. "How long?" she said. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "A week to start. I have the money." "I know you have the money," Mrs. Haverford said. "That's not what I was asking." She studied Clara for another moment. "You're the Beecham woman." I was supposed to be, Clara said. Mrs. Haverford made a sound that was not quite sympathy and not quite practicality, something between the two, the sound of a woman who had seen situations like this before and had strong feelings about the architecture of them. Rooms upstairs, second door, supper's at 6. She held out a key. And don't let anyone in this town tell you what you're owed or aren't owed until you know what you're talking about. There are people in this town who will try. Clara took the key. What kind of people? The kind that knows a woman alone is easier to manage than a woman with someone standing beside her, Mrs. Haverford said. Eat your supper before it gets cold. Clara went upstairs. She set her bag on the bed. She sat down next to it and looked at the wall and did the arithmetic she had been putting off since Pruitt's 2 words landed. $11.40. A week of boarding cost $2. She had at that rate roughly 5 weeks before the money ran out. 5 weeks to find work in a town that hadn't expected her and didn't need her. She was so deep in the arithmetic that when the knock came at the door, she startled badly enough to knock the bag off the bed. Supper? Mrs. Haverford said through the door. Now. Clara went to supper. There were 3 other boarders. 2 were miners, tired and uncommunicative in the way of men at the end of a long day. The 3rd was a woman of about 40 named Pearl, who was a seamstress and who looked at Clara with the same knowing assessment Mrs. Haverford had used and said, "You're the Beecham woman," in a way that was not unkind. "I'm Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "The arrangement with Mr. Beecham is no longer relevant." Pearl looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "There's work at the laundry on Tanner Street if you need it. The pay is low and the hours are long, but Marta Schultz, who runs it, doesn't let the men come past the front counter, which is worth something." Clara looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Pearl said. "Eat something. You look like you haven't had a real meal in 4 days." She hadn't. She was eating deliberately without looking up because she had not eaten since the morning stage stop, and her body had opinions about that when the door to the boarding house opened and the other people at the table did the thing. People did in small towns. When someone specific arrived, they adjusted. Not dramatically, just a slight reorientation of attention. A small collective acknowledgement that someone of particular weight in the room's social order had entered it. She looked up. He was tall enough that he'd had to clear the doorframe with some awareness. He wore a badge she noticed second, which was unusual. Badges usually announced themselves before the person wearing them. He had the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, which suggested time spent outdoors rather than time spent hard, and he moved through the room with the economy of a man who had been paying attention to everything for a long time and had gotten very good at it. He stopped when he saw her. Just a pause, half a second controlled, and she saw him take in the new face, the bag she hadn't brought down from her room, but whose absence probably still marked her as recent, the traveling dust that hadn't entirely washed out of her cuffs. "Evening, Mrs. Haverford," he said. "I'm sorry to come at supper." "Sheriff Cole," Mrs. Haverford said with the tone of a woman who had been expecting this. "You're not interrupting. Sit down if you're hungry. I won't stay." He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore." She put down her fork. "Yes." "Ethan Cole," he said. "I'm the town sheriff. I heard you arrived today." He held his hat in both hands, a deliberate choice. She registered it, the removal of the hat being the conscious choice of a man who understood signals. "I wanted to make sure you knew where the sheriff's office was, in case you needed it, and to tell you that if anyone in this town bothers you, I'd like to hear about it." She looked at him. She was accustomed to men who said things that sounded protective and meant something else, something proprietorial, something that began with, "You can rely on me," and ended with, "You owe me for it." She looked at Ethan Cole and did what she did with every man tried to find the angle. The second meaning, the place where the offer would eventually cost her something she hadn't agreed to pay. She couldn't find it, which was of itself unsettling. "Thank you," she said carefully. He nodded. He looked at Mrs. Haverford. "Aldous Pruitt came by the office this afternoon," he said, and his voice was easy, but something in it sharpened slightly. "I told him that offering a woman lodging in exchange for domestic arrangements is not something this office considers proper in present company." Mrs. Sound again. Good, she said. Clara looked between them. Pruitt came to your office. He did, Ethan said. What did he want? Ethan looked at her directly. Had she noticed a way of looking at people that was complete rather than searching, as if he'd already made up his mind to tell you the truth and was simply finding the right words? He wanted to know what your legal status was, whether you had any claim on Beecham's estate, whether anyone was going to be looking out for your interests in the short term. He paused. He presented this as concern. He's not concerned, Clara said. No. Ethan agreed. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because you should know who's paying attention to your situation and why, he said. You've been in this town 6 hours. You deserve to know what the room looks like before someone decides to rearrange it around you. She held his gaze. She was looking for it again, the angle, the cost, and she still couldn't find it, which was disorienting enough that she said more directly than she'd planned, What do you want from me, Sheriff Cole? He didn't flinch at the directness. Nothing, he said. I want you to eat your supper and get some sleep and come to the office tomorrow if you have questions about your situation. That's the entire list. He put his hat on. He said goodnight to Mrs. Haverford and Pearl and nodded to the miners, and he left. Clara picked up her fork. She ate in silence for a moment. Pearl said quietly, He's been sheriff here 3 years. In those 3 years, 2 men who bothered women in this town lost the privilege of staying in it. She said it without drama, like a piece of useful civic information. Lost how? Clara said. Persuasively, Pearl said, and went back to her food. That night, Clara laid on the narrow boarding house bed and did not sleep. She lay there and thought about Abilene, which she had left 2 weeks ago, with $11.40, and a letter from a dead man, and the belief that whatever waited in Dust Hollow was better than what she was leaving behind. She thought about her mother, who had died when she was 17, and left her in the care of a stepfather who had made it clear that her presence in his house was a temporary arrangement dependent on her compliance with a set of conditions he reserved the right to change without notice. She thought about the stepfather's business partner, who had suggested the Beecham arrangement with a helpfulness that had taken her 3 months to identify as convenient. He had wanted her gone. The arrangement had accomplished that without requiring him to do anything ungentlemanly. She thought about Harold Beecham, who had been dead for 3 weeks. She could not feel grief for a man she'd never met, but she felt something the particular hollow of an ending that had never been a beginning, the grief of a plan that had required her to accept something she didn't want, and hadn't even gotten the resolution of arriving. She thought about Ethan Cole, who had come to the boarding house to tell her what the room looked like. She told herself she did not know anything about him yet. She told herself that men who made good first impressions were not an unfamiliar category. She told herself to be careful with what she allowed herself to believe about a person based on a 10-minute supper conversation. She told herself all of this and meant all of it. And then she went to sleep, which was the first time she'd slept properly in 4 days. In the morning, she went to the laundry on Tanner Street. Marta Schultz was a large woman who ran a tight operation and did not waste words or time. She looked at Clara's hands, a universal assessment Clara had noticed among people who worked with their hands professionally, and said, "Can you press?" "Yes," Clara said. "Can you manage volume without losing quality?" "Yes," Clara said. "I pay by the piece, not the hour," Marta said. "You get fast, you earn better. You get sloppy, you work somewhere else." "Clear." "Clear," Clara said. "Start now," Marta said, and handed her an apron. Clara worked the laundry for 6 hours. She was fast. She had been doing laundry since she was 12, and she had the particular muscle memory of someone for whom household work had never been optional, which was not an experience she'd have chosen, but which she was discovering had the secondary benefit of making her employable in almost any town in the American West. At noon, Marta brought her a plate of bread and cold chicken and said, "You're good at this." "I know," Clara said. Then she paused, because she had learned to soften that kind of statement for other people's comfort, and then had been deciding lately that she was tired of softening it. "Thank you," she added. Marta looked at her with something that was the beginning of respect. "Aldous Pruitt came by this morning," she said, "before you arrived, He suggested I shouldn't hire you. Clara went still. What did he say? He said you were a woman of uncertain circumstance, and that your presence might complicate some business arrangements in town. Marta picked up a shirt and shook it out with decisive efficiency. I told him that uncertain circumstance is the founding condition of most people in this territory, and that his opinion of my hiring decisions was not something I had requested. Clara looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. This time she meant it entirely. Don't thank me, Marta said. Work. She worked. By the end of the day, she had earned enough for 2 days of boarding, which was not the same as enough, but was in the direction of it. She walked back to Mrs. Haverford's along the main street of Dust Hollow in the early evening, and she thought about 5 weeks shrinking to something more manageable, and she was thinking about that when she nearly walked directly into Aldous Pruitt. He was standing outside the bank with another man she didn't know, middle-aged, well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that meant money rather than taste. Pruitt saw her, and his expression did the thing she'd seen that first afternoon, the calculation, the opening of the door. Miss Whitmore, he said. Good timing. This is Gerald Hatch. He's a land agent. He was a friend of Harold's. Gerald Hatch looked at her with an assessing quality she had encountered before in men who thought of women primarily as problem-solving mechanisms. I understand you've had a difficult arrival, he said. Harold spoke of you. He had certain provisions in mind. I wasn't aware of any provisions, Clara said. No, of course not, Hatch said smoothly. But there are matters relating to Harold's estate that a woman in your position might find worth discussing. He smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes. Perhaps we could sit down tomorrow. The bank has a quiet office. If there are legal matters relating to Harold Beecham's estate that involve me, Clara said, I'd like to have the sheriff present for that conversation. Hatch's smile went a different direction. That's not necessary. I think it is, Clara said. I'll have Sheriff Cole contact you to arrange a time. She walked away. She heard Hatch say something to Pruitt behind her low not meant for her. She did not turn around. She walked until she was clear of them, and then she stopped in a doorway and put her hand against the wall and breathed. She did not know what provisions meant. She did not know what business Hatch had with Beecham's estate, or what it had to do with her, or why Aldous Pruitt was suddenly very interested in introducing her to land agents. She knew only that the room was being rearranged around her the way Ethan Cole had said it might be, and she did not have enough information yet to know how to stop it. She needed more information. She went to the sheriff's office. Ethan Cole was at his desk when she pushed through the door, and he looked up at her with the same reading the situation quality he'd had at the boarding house, fast complete, landing on something that shifted him forward in his chair. What happened? He said. She told him. Pruitt Hatch, the bank, the provisions, the word estate hanging in the air like something waiting to be claimed. He listened without interrupting. Which she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened entirely, with the particular quality of a man to whom the information mattered more than his own reaction to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder and looked through it with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew what he was looking for. He found the page he wanted and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. Harold Beecham had a will, he said, filed with the county office before he died. I've had a copy since the day he passed because he specifically asked me to hold one. He set the page on the desk between them so she could read it. He left his land 40 acres north of town to the woman he had arranged to marry. By name, Clara looked at the page. She looked at her own name written in a dead man's hand. Clara Whitmore, and felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she did not yet have a word for. He left it to me, she said. Yes, Ethan said. I never met him. No. Ethan looked at her steadily. But he knew enough about the situation you were coming from that he wanted to make sure you arrived somewhere rather than nowhere. He paused. He was a better man than people here generally give him credit for. She looked at the page. She thought about Harold Beecham, dead 3 weeks, who had written her name in a will before she'd arrived, who had thought about what she was coming from and had built something in for it. Pruitt knew about this, she said slowly. Yes, Ethan said. And Hatch. Hatch has been trying to acquire that parcel for 2 years, Ethan said. It sits on top of the only reliable water source in the North Valley. There are 3 ranches that depend on access to it. Harold knew that. He didn't sell. He looked at her. The moment Harold died, Hatch started working out how to get it. Clara looked at the will. She looked at her name on the page. And now I have it, she said. And now you have it, Ethan said. The air in the small office was very still. She sat with what she was holding, not just the paper, but the thing the paper represented. 40 acres. Water rights. The thing that made 2 men arrange to bump into her on the street and invite her to quiet bank offices. They think I don't know what it is, she said. They think you're a woman who arrived without anyone, Ethan said. They think you're scared and alone and in need of guidance. I am scared, she said. That doesn't mean I'm going to let them use it. Ethan looked at her. Something in his face settled the same thing she'd seen at supper, the thing she'd tried to find the angle of and couldn't. No, he said. I didn't think you would. She picked up the page. She set it back down. She looked at him. What do you think I should do? I think you should have a lawyer look at the will, he said. There's a man in the next county who handles property cases and isn't connected to anyone in this town, which is important. He paused. And I think you should let me escort you to and from the laundry until Pruitt and Hatch understand that you're not going to be managed. She looked at him. You do that. I told you yesterday, he said. Nothing on that list is complicated. Escorting a woman who came to marry a dead man and accidentally inherited valuable land is a little complicated, she said. This is the frontier, he said. This is a slow week. She almost laughed. The impulse surprised her real laughter, not the performed kind she'd been using on polite company for years. She got it back under control before it fully arrived, but she could tell from the slight shift in his face that he'd seen it come and go. She stood up. Tomorrow morning then, she said. Tanner Street. 7 o'clock, he said. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned around. Sheriff Cole? He looked up. Ethan told me his name is Beecham, the will had said. She looked at the will still on his desk. The will says Harold was expecting I would be frightened when I arrived. He wrote, she had read it in those few seconds. He wrote, see to it she is not left alone the first night in a town she doesn't know. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He asked me that, yes, he said. 3 days before he died. And you came to the boarding house. I came to the boarding house, he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about a dead man she'd never met who had thought far enough ahead to write her name in a will and ask the sheriff to look after her the first night. She thought about what it meant that the people she'd expected to need protection from were Pruitt and Hatch, and the person who had actually shown up was a quiet lawman with a hat in his hands who wanted nothing from her except for her to eat her supper. Good night, she said. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said. She walked back to the boarding house. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed with the lamp lit, and she thought about 40 acres and water rights, and Gerald Hatch's smile that didn't reach his eyes, and she thought about Aldous Pruitt and the first conversation, and the way he'd opened a door she hadn't wanted to walk through. And she thought about a man who had come at supper time with his hat in his hands to tell her what the room looked like. She had been afraid of so many things. She had rehearsed so many of them on the 4-day stagecoach ride. She had been so certain she knew the shape of what was coming. She had been wrong about almost all of it. The fear she'd prepared for hadn't arrived. The threat she hadn't seen coming, Pruitt Hatch, the land, the money had arrived instead, which was how danger worked when it was working correctly from the direction you weren't watching. But something else had also arrived from the direction she wasn't watching. Something she did not have a category for yet. She was going to be careful. She was going to be very careful. She had learned at 17 that misreading a man's intentions cost more than the lesson was worth. But she was going to be present for what was happening, instead of managing it from behind a wall. She was going to find out what the 40 acres meant, and what Hatch wanted, and what Pruitt was building toward. She was going to find out what it looked like to stand in a town she didn't know, and hold something of value, and not let anyone take it, because they had decided her uncertainty made her manageable. She was not manageable. She had been surviving for 6 years on the belief that caution was the safest position. She was beginning to suspect cautiously carefully, with full awareness, that suspicions were not the same as facts, that there was something on the other side of caution that she had not yet allowed herself to see. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark of Dust Hollow, Colorado, in 1878, with 40 acres of water-rich land in her name, and a dead man's kindness between her and the worst version of the thing she'd feared. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, she felt something that was not terror, and not relief, and not the numb efficiency of survival. She felt very quietly like a person with possibilities. She held on to that. She let it be there. She did not press it down. Ethan was at the corner of Tanner Street at 7 o'clock exactly. He didn't make a production of it. No announcement, no particular posture of protection. He was simply there, leaning against the post outside the feed store with his coffee, the way a man stands somewhere he has a reason to be and isn't performing the reason. Clara saw him from half a block away and felt the thing she always felt when something she'd been bracing against didn't arrive, a small involuntary release of tension that she immediately gathered back up because released tension was a habit she could not afford. She had slept. She had eaten Mrs. Haverford's breakfast. She had thought in the clear morning light about everything she'd let herself feel the night before, and she had made a decision about it. She was going to be precise. She was going to deal with Hatch and Pruitt with the same precision she brought to the laundry efficiently, without sentiment, keeping her quality consistent and her exposure minimal. She was going to be careful with Ethan Cole in the same way, and for the same reason. Quality required not letting anything contaminate the process. "Morning," he said when she reached him. "Morning," she said. He fell into step beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. She noticed it, the way she noticed all of Ethan Cole's choices, as deliberate signals from a man who understood that how you moved around a person said more than what you said to them. "I sent a wire to Robert Carey in Pueblo last night," he said. "He's the property lawyer I mentioned. He can be here by Thursday." "That's fast," she said. "I told him the situation was time-sensitive," Ethan said. "Hatch has been known to file competing claims when he thinks the title holder doesn't know what they have. The faster we have a lawyer looking at the will, the fewer options he has." She glanced at him. "You sent the wire last night, after I left." "It seemed worth doing quickly," he said. She thought about this, about a man who said nothing required anything complicated, and then spent his evening doing the complicated things without being asked. She thought about what it meant, and then she thought about what she had decided about being precise, and she filed it without comment. They reached the laundry. She pushed through the door. Ethan stayed on the boardwalk, which she had expected, but he didn't leave, which she had not. She saw him through the front window, moving to a position where he could see both directions of the street without appearing to watch for anything. Marta came out of the back. She saw Ethan through the window. She looked at Clara. "He's not coming in," Clara said. "I know he's not coming in," Marta said. "I have a rule." "I know about the rule," Clara said. "He's just standing outside." Marta looked at Ethan another moment. "That man," she said, "has stood outside places where women needed someone standing outside more times than this town gives him credit for." She handed Clara an apron. "Don't make the mistake of thinking it's nothing." Clara put on the apron. "I'm not making any mistakes," she said. Said Marta, which was not agreement and was not disagreement, and was entirely too perceptive for 7:15 in the morning. She worked the full morning. The laundry was straightforward. In the way that hard physical work was always straightforward, the demands were clear and the results were visible, and the measure of success was immediate and tactile. She was good at it. She had always been better at concrete problems than abstract ones, which was why the situation with Hatch and Pruitt bothered her more than it might have otherwise. She didn't know what the problem was yet. She couldn't work a problem she couldn't see all the edges of. At mid-morning, Pearl came into the laundry. This was unusual. Pearl was a seamstress, not a laundry customer. She came in the front with a specific expression, found Clara at the pressing table, and said, "I have something to tell you, and I need to tell you quickly." Clara set down the iron. "What?" Pearl glanced at the front window where Ethan was visible at his position on the boardwalk. "I heard something last night at the boarding house. After supper, Pruitt came by to speak with Mrs. Haverford." "About what?" "About you," Pearl said. "He was asking her what you'd said to her, whether you'd mentioned the land, whether you seemed like you knew about it." She paused. "Mrs. Haverford told him nothing before you worry about that. But the point is, he was at the boarding house after 9 o'clock asking questions, which means he's moving faster than you might think." Clara considered this. "He's trying to find out what I know before the lawyer gets here." Pearl blinked. "You already have a lawyer coming." "Thursday," Clara said. "From Pueblo." Pearl looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone revising an assessment. "You move fast." "I had help," Clara said. She looked at Ethan's outline through the window. "Is there anything else Pruitt said to Mrs. Haverford?" "He said something about a prior arrangement," Pearl said, lowering her voice. "Something about Beecham having agreed before he died to a sale option on the north parcel. Pruitt's claiming there's a document." Clara went still. "What document?" "He didn't say, but he said it predated the will and might supersede it." Pearl looked at her directly. "I don't know if it's real." Clara picked up the iron. She set it back down. She looked at the window. "Thank you, Pearl." Pearl left. Clara worked 3 more shirts without really feeling them, her mind running the specific arithmetic of what she'd just learned. A prior agreement, a document that predated the will. If Pruitt had something like that, or claimed to the 4 days until Thursday became considerably more urgent. She went to the front of the laundry and opened the door and said, "Ethan." He was there in 2 seconds. He read her face. "What happened?" She told him in the street quickly and precisely. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 5 seconds. She counted them, because she was beginning to understand that his silences were processing rather than absence. "There's no prior agreement," he said. "I've seen every document filed in connection with Beecham's property for the past 2 years. There's nothing." "Pruitt could be claiming there's one that wasn't filed," she said. "Something private. He could claim it," Ethan said. "But he'd have to produce it in front of a judge, which is much harder to do if your lawyer is already there contesting it." He looked at her. "I'll send another wire to Carey. Ask him to come Wednesday instead." "You think Pruitt will act before Thursday?" "I think Pruitt is already acting," Ethan said. "He's at the boarding house at 9 at night asking Mrs. Haverford questions. That's not careful. That's worried." He held her gaze. "Worried men make faster moves. We should move faster too." She looked at him. She thought about precision. She thought about being careful with what she allowed herself to believe about a person. She thought about a man sending wires at night, standing on boardwalks at 7 in the morning, telling her what the room looked like before someone else rearranged it. "Wednesday," she said. Yes, she worked the full day. Ethan was gone by noon. He had a town to run, and she was not his only responsibility. And she understood that, but he came back at 5:30 when the laundry closed and walked her to the boarding house and said, "Carey can be here Wednesday afternoon," before he left, which meant he had sent the second wire between 11 and 5. "You're very efficient," she said. "I told you it wasn't complicated," he said. "You keep saying that about things that are clearly complicated," she said. Something moved in his face. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night," she said. She hesitated. "Clara," she said. "You can call me Clara." He looked at her. "Good night, Clara," he said. He said her name the way he said most things, plainly, without any decoration, and it was somehow that plainness that made it land precisely where it did. She went inside. She sat at supper. She told Mrs. Haverford while the miners were occupied with their food, what Pearl had said about Pruitt's visit. Mrs. Haverford listened without changing expression. When Clara finished, she said, "He's been here twice before. Once when the Hanson woman arrived after her husband died. Once when the Creighton girl came looking for her brother." She poured coffee with the efficiency of a woman who had decided something long ago about the kind of house she was going to run. Both times, Ethan Cole was the thing that made the difference. "What do you mean by difference?" Clara asked. "I mean the Hanson woman still has her property," Mrs. Haverford said, "and the Creighton girl's brother got his money back." She looked at Clara steadily. "He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't want anything for it. I have been watching this town for 20 years, and I know the difference between a man who helps because it builds his reputation and a man who helps because he can't look himself in the eye if he doesn't." Clara held her coffee cup. She thought about what she'd decided that morning about precision and contamination and not letting anything in that she hadn't verified. She thought about verified. She was verifying. Tuesday passed. She worked. Ethan walked her to the laundry and was there at 5:30, and in between, they did not see each other, and she found with a precision that disturbed her that she noticed the in-between more than she had expected to. Wednesday. Robert Carey arrived on the afternoon stage. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the organized manner of a man who traveled frequently with important documents and had developed very specific habits around keeping them organized. He met with her and Ethan in the sheriff's office with the will on the desk and the certified copy she'd requested from the county office and everything that had happened since she arrived laid out in order. Carey read the will. He read it again. He looked up. "This is valid," he said. "Properly witnessed, properly filed, unambiguous in its language. The property passes to Clara Whitmore, now present as named." He looked at her. "You are the legal owner of 40 acres north of town." She heard the words. She heard them land with a weight that was entirely different from the weight of the word estate when Hatch had used it. This was not a negotiating position. This was a fact. "Pruitt is claiming a prior agreement exists," she said. Carey looked at Ethan. "Is there a filed prior agreement?" "Nothing in the county record," Ethan said. "Then he has two options," Carey said. "He produces a private document meaning something unwitnessed or unrecorded, or he files a competing claim and attempts to argue it supersedes the will in court." He set down his pen. Either path is weak. A private document from a dead man with no witnesses is difficult to authenticate. A competing claim against a properly filed will with a living named beneficiary is even harder. He looked at Clara. "They're hoping you don't know that." "How long before they understand that I do?" she said. "How long until I can speak with Pruitt and Hatch directly?" Carey asked. "I can arrange that for tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "Then by tomorrow afternoon," Carey said, "they will know that you have representation and that the legal ground they thought they were standing on does not exist." Clara looked at the will on the desk, at her name in a dead man's handwriting, at the clean legal fact of 40 acres that nobody had thought she was competent to hold. "What do I do with the land?" she said. Carey looked at her. "Whatever you choose," he said. "You could sell it. You could lease the water rights to the ranches that currently depend on them that would generate consistent income without requiring you to manage the parcel directly. You could develop it." He paused. "My recommendation would be to make no major decisions for 90 days. Establish your position in this town first. Let anyone who wants to challenge the will do so and be shown that it holds. Then decide." She nodded. "That's what I'll do." The meeting with Pruitt and Hatch was scheduled for 10 the next morning in Carey's temporary office at the hotel. She asked to be there. Carey said, "It might be more comfortable for you if—" "I want to be there," she said. "It's my land. I'll be in the room." Ethan looked at her from across the desk with the expression she had begun to catalog, the one where something in him settled the small release of a thing he'd been holding that was no longer necessary to hold. "She'll be in the room," he said to Carey, simply, without discussion. Carey looked between them. He said, "Of course." She slept that night with the particular quality of sleep that came not from ease, but from resolution. The body's acknowledgement that a decision had been made, and the deciding was done, and what remained was only the doing. She slept solidly, completely, clarity of someone who knows exactly what they're walking toward. She dressed carefully. She ate breakfast. Mrs. Haverford said nothing, but pressed an extra biscuit onto her plate with the silent emphasis of a woman providing supplies for a campaign. At 9:45, she walked to the hotel. Ethan was in the lobby. He looked at her and said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. "They're already up there," he said. Hatch brought his own lawyer. She had not expected that. She felt it, the recalibration, the quick internal adjustment. "What kind of lawyer?" "Property," Ethan said. "Man named Dills. He's been involved in 3 of Hatch's acquisitions in this county." He looked at her steadily. "Carey knows his work. He's aggressive, but he's not creative. He works from intimidation, not from evidence." "Then we have the evidence, and he has the intimidation," she said. "Yes. That should be a manageable trade," she said. He held the door for her. She walked through. The room had 4 people in it: Pruitt, Hatch, Dills, and Carey. Pruitt looked at her arrival with an expression she read immediately as recalculated. He had expected she understood that she would send Carey without coming herself, because that was what a frightened woman would do. And he had built his opening around a frightened woman. Hatch was more controlled. Dills was the kind of lawyer who assessed the room for leverage before he assessed it for anything else. And she could see him doing that now, landing on Ethan beside her and adjusting something. She sat down. Ethan took a position at the wall, not at the table, not in anyone's seat, just present the way a fact is present. Carey opened. He stated the will, the filing, the validity, the legal position of Clara Whitmore, as named beneficiary and current owner of the north parcel. He was brief and he was clear, and when he finished, he looked at Dills and said, "I understand you have a position to present." Dills produced a document. He slid it across the table toward Carey. "A letter of intent," he said, "signed by Harold Beecham 14 months ago, in which he agrees to give Gerald Hatch right of first purchase on the north parcel in the event of his death or decision to sell." Carey picked it up. He read it. He looked at Clara. She looked at it, and he turned it so she could read it too. She read it carefully. She looked at Beecham's signature at the bottom. She looked at the date. Then she looked at Dills. "This letter is dated March of last year," she said. "Yes," Dills said. "Harold Beecham's will is dated November, she said. 8 months after this letter." Dills said nothing. "A will supersedes a letter of intent," Carey said without inflection, "particularly when the will specifically identifies the disposition of the asset in question and makes no reference to any prior right of purchase arrangement." He set the letter on the table. Mr. Beecham had 8 months between signing this letter and writing his will. He chose to leave the property to Miss Whitmore. That choice is legally recorded and witnessed. This letter is not a competing claim. It is an older document that the deceased chose to supersede. Hatch leaned forward. "Beecham knew about my arrangement. Then he had the opportunity to honor it in his will," Carey said. "He did not. The will is the final expression of his intentions. It is also the legal one." The room was quiet for a moment. Pruitt was looking at the table. Dills was looking at his document. Hatch was looking at Clara with an expression that had moved from assessment to something with an edge she did not care for. "You're a woman who arrived in this town a week ago," Hatch said. "You have no connection to this land, no knowledge of what it requires." "She owns it," Ethan said from the wall. It was the first time he'd spoken. He said it the way he said most things, flat final, not a challenge but a fact, stated in a tone that made clear it would not be restated. Hatch looked at him. Ethan looked back. The silence was brief and entirely one-sided. Dills put his document away. He looked at Carey. "We'll be in touch." "My office in Pueblo," Carey said. "In writing." Hatch and Pruitt and Dills stood. They filed out. Pruitt passed Clara without looking at her, which told her everything about his assessment of how the meeting had gone. Hatch stopped beside her chair and looked down at her and said, The land is not as simple as your lawyer is making it sound. I look forward to the complexity, she said. He walked out. Carrie closed his folder. He looked at her. He said, "That went well?" "Will they try again?" she asked. "Dills will look for another angle," he said. "But they've shown their strongest card, and it didn't hold. Each subsequent attempt will be weaker." He paused. "I'll stay through Friday to be sure. After that, they'll know any further action goes through me, which makes it expensive and slow. Expensive and slow are the natural enemies of Hatch's style of operation." She thanked him. She stood up. She and Ethan walked out of the hotel and into the main street of Dust Hollow, and she stood in the morning air and breathed. "You did that well," Ethan said. "Carrie did that," she said. "Carrie stated the law," Ethan said. "You walked into the room and sat down when a woman who was still afraid would have sent someone else. That's not Carrie's work, that's yours. That's—" She looked at him. She thought about what she had decided about precision. She thought about verified. She thought about the morning she'd arrived with her bag and her $11 and the 4-day journey behind her, and the morning she'd walked into a hotel meeting with her lawyer and her land, and a man who said she owned it like it was the most obvious fact in the room. The distance between those 2 mornings was 8 days. 8 days was not very long. She knew better than to weigh 8 days too heavily. She weighed them anyway. "I have to get back to the laundry," she said. "I'll walk you," he said. They walked. Halfway down the main street, she said, "Why did you become the sheriff here?" He thought about it. "Somebody needed to be," he said. "I was better at it than the alternatives." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "The real answer is that I spent 6 years moving around and I got tired of moving, and this was a place that needed someone to stay." He looked straight ahead. Staying felt like something worth doing. She thought about that. She thought about a man who got tired of moving and chose to stay. "Do you regret it?" "No," he said. "Not once." They reached the laundry. She stopped at the door. "Can I ask you something directly?" "You always do," he said. And it was not a criticism. It was the same contained recognition she had seen in him when she walked into the hotel meeting, the acknowledgement of a quality he had already categorized as simply how she was. She looked at him. "Harold Beecham asked you to look after me. You did that. The will is established. Carrie is here. Hatch and Pruitt have been answered. Your obligation is discharged." She held his gaze. "So why are you still here?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, completely without hurry. "Because I want to be," he said. That's the entire answer. She held his gaze for one long moment. She thought about precision. She thought about what she had decided that first morning about being careful and about not letting anything in that she hadn't verified. She had been verifying for 8 days. She had not found an angle. She had not found a cost. She had not found the place where the offer would require her to pay something she hadn't agreed to. "All right," she said. He waited. "I'm glad," she said, "that you want to be." She said it plainly and without decoration, because she had learned from him that plainness was not the absence of meaning. It was meaning at its most concentrated, without anything added to make it easier to receive. He looked at her for another moment. Something in his face did the settling thing. The small release, the quiet arrival of something that had been on its way. "Good," he said. Just that. The single word he had used in the hotel meeting stated in the same tone. A fact. She went into the laundry. She put on her apron. She pressed shirts for 3 hours with the specific focus of a woman who has made an internal decision and is giving it the dignity of not examining it further until the examining is done. Marta watched her from the far side of the room without saying anything. She had the quality of a woman who understood that some things did not need commentary. At 4 o'clock, a boy came into the laundry with a note. He handed it to Clara and left. She read it. It was from Pearl. 3 words come tonight. Mrs. Haverford's. She arrived at the boarding house at 6 to find Pearl and Mrs. Haverford at the kitchen table, with the expression of women who have something to say and have decided now is the time to say it. She sat down. "Hatch went to see Judge Fowler this afternoon," Mrs. Haverford said. "An hour after your meeting." Clara went still. "What did he want?" "We don't know exactly," Pearl said. "But Fowler was at the general store an hour after that asking about you, about where you were from, about the arrangement with Beecham, about whether anyone knew your family." Clara thought about Abilene, about her stepfather, about the arrangement that had sent her here, and who had arranged it, and whether anyone in Dust Hollow could find that man if they looked hard enough. "Someone is going to go back to Abilene," she said. "That's what we think," Pearl said. She sat with that for a moment. She had not told Ethan about Abilene. She had not told anyone in Dust Hollow about Abilene. She had arrived with a name and a situation and no context. And she had been grateful for the lack of context, and she was now understanding that the lack of context was not a shield. It was simply a surface that someone sufficiently motivated could scratch through. If Hatch sent someone to Abilene, and that someone found her stepfather, and her stepfather decided to provide information, she did not know what information he would provide, but she knew the shape of men like him, the way they constructed narratives around their own convenience, and she knew the narrative would not be kind. She went to find Ethan. He was at the office. She came through the door, and he looked up, and his face did the reading thing, and he said, "Tell me." She told him. All of it this time, not just Hatch and Fowler, but Abilene. The stepfather, the arrangement, the specific quality of a situation that had been designed to remove her from someone else's inconvenient life. She told him with the precision she brought to everything, and without looking away, because she had decided that if she was going to trust this man with what she'd been building in the last 8 days, she was not going to build it on half a foundation. When she finished, he was quiet for the same 5 seconds he always took. Then he said, "Your stepfather, does he have any legal claim on you?" "I'm 23, she said. "No." "Has he ever filed anything, any guardianship document, any business arrangement that named you?" "No," she said. "He arranged the marriage informally. There's nothing on paper." "Then what he can do," Ethan said, "is talk. He can tell Hatch things about your history that Hatch can try to use to paint you as unreliable or of uncertain character. He cannot create a legal claim where there isn't one." He held her gaze. "The question is, how much that kind of talking would cost you in this town?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I've only been here 8 days. You've been here 8 days, and you have a lawyer, a laundry job, and 2 women in your corner who don't extend that to people they don't trust," he said. "Hatch is going to find that harder to overcome than he thinks." He paused. "I'm going to tell Carrie tonight. He should know the full picture before he leaves Friday." She nodded. She looked at her hands on her knees. She looked up at him. "I should have told you about Abilene before," she said. "You told me when it mattered," he said. "That's enough. You're very—" She stopped. She started again. "You make it very easy to tell you things." He looked at her with that complete, unhurried attention. "Good," he said. She sat in the sheriff's office for another half hour while he wrote to Carrie, and she did not fill the silence with anything, and neither did he, and the silence had the specific quality that all their silences had developed, not empty but inhabited the sound of 2 people who had arrived at something they were not yet naming, but were not pretending they couldn't see. She walked back to the boarding house. She went upstairs. She stood at the window for a moment before she lit the lamp. 8 days. She had been in Dust Hollow for 8 days. She had land and a lawyer and work, and 2 women who had brought her information because they had decided she was worth protecting. She had a man who walked her to the laundry and sent wires at night and told her what the room looked like before anyone else could rearrange it. She had come here afraid of a night she'd thought she knew the shape of. The night had been nothing like she'd feared. The days had been nothing like she'd feared. She was afraid of something different now. Something quieter and more specifically personal than anything Pruitt or Hatch could arrange. She was afraid of how much she had already stopped being afraid of Ethan Cole, specifically of what was building between them, of the specific possibility that she was beginning to believe in a person the way she had not believed in anyone since she was 17 years old, and her mother was still alive. She lit the lamp. She sat on the bed. She told herself to be careful. She told herself that and meant it, and knew with the clarity that came from 8 days of verifying that careful was no longer the right word for where she was. She was paying attention. She was present. She was in this town with her land and her work and the life she was building from scratch, and she was not pressing any of it down. That was not the same as being careful. It was considerably better. Carrie left Friday morning with a handshake and a promise to file the formal ownership documentation with the territorial court in Pueblo before the end of the following week. Clara stood outside the hotel and watched the stage pull away, and felt the specific vulnerability of having had a professional shield, and now not having it the way you feel a bandage when it's removed. Not painful, just newly exposed. Ethan was beside her. He said, "Carrie knows what he's doing." "I know," she said. "And Hatch knows Carrie knows what he's doing," he said. "Which matters more?" She turned back to the main street. The laundry was open. She had 4 hours of work before noon. She had a life to build in a town that was still making up its mind about her, and the building didn't pause because a lawyer had left on a stage. She went to work. The week that followed had a rhythm to it that she had not expected, not the tense provisional rhythm of her first 8 days, but something steadier. She worked the laundry. She walked to the sheriff's office in the evenings, sometimes for specific reasons, and sometimes because it had become the most natural thing to do at the end of a day, the place where the day's information was sorted and the next day's plan was made. Ethan walked her back. They talked on the walk about the town, about the land, about the ranches to the north that depended on the water rights, about the smaller details of the life she was assembling piece by piece in a place she had arrived at by accident. She was not calling it home yet. She was aware enough of her own patterns to know that calling something home was an act she tended to delay past the point where the word was already true, a form of protection that had stopped protecting her, but that she hadn't yet replaced with anything else. On Tuesday of the second week, she asked Ethan to take her to the north parcel. She had not seen it. She had been the legal owner of 40 acres for 10 days and had never set foot on a single one of them, which she had decided was a thing she needed to correct. She needed to know what she had. She could not make a decision about something she had never stood inside. They rode out in the early morning before the laundry opened. Ethan had a horse, and he arranged one for her without being asked, which she noted and did not comment on. She could ride. She had grown up in Abilene around horses, and she swung up without waiting for assistance, which made something in Ethan's face do the settling thing. They rode north in the morning quiet. The land opened up around them, and she looked at it with the working attention of a woman who had arrived in this territory, planning to stay, and was now deciding what staying would look like. "Tell me what I'm looking at," she said. Ethan told her. He knew the land the way he knew the town practically completely, without romance and without underselling. The parcel ran from the North Creek down through a slope of good grazing ground to a flat section that had once been plowed but hadn't been farmed in 3 years. The water rights covered the spring at the creek's origin, which fed 2 other creeks that ran through the Harmon Ranch and the Kettles operation to the east. Beecham had leased those rights to both families for 8 years at a rate that everyone involved understood was considerably below their actual value. He was generous with them, Clara said. He was, Ethan said. Both families have been worried since he died about what happens to the arrangement. Have they spoken to me? They've been waiting to see how the ownership question settled, he said. Now that it's settled, he glanced at her. Jim Harmon is a decent man. Walt Kettles is more cautious but honest. Either of them would be worth talking to. She rode the edge of the parcel and thought about what Carrie had said, lease the water rights at a fair rate. Don't make major decisions for 90 days. Let the position establish itself. She thought about what a fair rate meant for 2 ranching families who had been paying below value for 8 years and had organized their operations around that number. She thought about what it meant to need something from someone and whether the power of being needed was something she wanted to use the way it could be used. She didn't. She had come from a situation where she was needed, and the needing had been converted into leverage, and she had strong opinions about that conversion. I want to talk to both of them, she said. This week if possible." "I can arrange that," Ethan said. "Before you do," she said, "I want to know what you think a fair lease rate is. Not what Carrie would say. What you think." He looked at her. He thought about it honestly. She could see him thinking the slight forward tilt of his attention. He named a number. It was considerably more than Beecham had charged, but considerably less than the maximum the land could command. "Why that number?" she said. "Because it's what the ranches can absorb without strain in a good year and without crisis in a bad one," he said. "You're not trying to extract the maximum from people who have nowhere else to go. You're trying to establish a rate that holds through bad years as well as good ones. A rate that breaks them in a drought year does you no good. You lose the income anyway, and you lose the relationship." She looked at the land. "You're describing what I was already thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I could see you working it out." She looked at him. "You watch me think." "You think clearly," he said. "It's worth watching." She turned back to the parcel. She felt the morning around her, the open space of it, the particular quality of air that came off high land. She had been in this territory for 2 weeks, and she was still learning what it sounded like when it was quiet, which was nothing like Abilene's quiet, which had always had an edge to it, something waiting in it. This quiet was just quiet. She was beginning to understand the difference. They rode back to town. She went to the laundry. She thought about Jim Harmon and Walt Kettles and fair rates and the specific thing it meant to have power over someone's necessity and choose not to use it as leverage. She thought about her stepfather, who had never made that choice once in his life. She thought about Ethan, who made it every time. The meetings with Harmon and Kettles happened Thursday afternoon. Ethan arranged them but did not attend, which she had asked him about beforehand, and he had said, "It's your land, your negotiation. If you want me there, I'll be there. If you don't need me." She had thought about it and said she'd go alone, and she had seen in his face the same settling thing, the acknowledgement that she had made the right call, offered without comment, because comment wasn't needed. Jim Harmon was 60, direct and relieved in a way he tried to contain and couldn't entirely. He had been worrying about the water arrangement for 6 weeks, and the worry had accumulated in the set of his shoulders, and the way he shook her hand too firm, the grip of a man managing anxiety. She told him the rate she had decided on. He stared at her. "That's fair," he said, like he hadn't expected it. "I know it is," she said. "I want it in writing through Carrie's office for a 5-year term, so neither of us is worrying about it every 6 weeks. He shook her hand again. This time the grip was different. Walt Kettles was 45 and more guarded, and he came to the meeting with a prepared argument. She could see him assembling behind his eyes before she'd finished her first sentence. She told him the same rate and the same terms before he could deploy the argument. He sat back. He said, "Why?" "Because fair rates last," she said. "And I intend to be here a long time." He looked at her for a moment. "Hatch offered me double that rate to support his claim on the parcel," he said. She kept her face still. "He offered you money to testify against the will. He offered me consulting fees to provide a character assessment of Beecham's mental state in his final months," Kettles said. The quotation marks were audible. "Which would have amounted to the same thing." "Did you agree?" "No," Kettles said. "Beecham was the sanest man I knew in his final months." He looked at her. "He told me the last time I saw him that he had an arrangement coming that he felt good about. That the woman who was coming knew what hardship was and would know what to do with land that was worth something." He paused. "I think he meant you." Clara sat with that for a moment. A dead man she'd never met had thought about her, had built something for her, had said something to his neighbor about her. "Sign the lease," she said. 5 years. I'll have Carrie send the papers within the week." She walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon with 2 handshakes and a settled feeling she had not anticipated when she'd woken up that morning. She had land with tenants who were honest and neighbors who had turned down Hatch's money. She had a lawyer filing documents in Pueblo. She had a laundry job that paid and a room that was hers as long as she paid for it. She had a life taking shape. She went to the sheriff's office. Ethan looked up. He read her face. "Both of them," he said. "Both of them," she confirmed. She sat down across from his desk. She had stopped waiting to be invited to sit, which had happened sometime around day 10, without a defined moment. Kettles told me something. She told him about Hatch's offer. Ethan's face went through a sequence she had not seen before, controlled but moving through something with more heat in it than his usual stillness. He said, "Hatch offered him consulting fees." "Yes." "And Kettles told you?" "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's useful," he said. "That's the kind of information Carrie can use if Hatch files anything further. Attempting to purchase testimony to contest a will is not a small thing." He looked at her. "Kettles would say this to Carrie." "He told me without being asked," she said. "I think he'd say it to anyone who needed to hear it." Ethan made a note. She watched him make it the precise economic handwriting of a man who had learned to record things accurately, because accuracy mattered in his work. She thought about the specific quality of a man whose habits were all built around accountability to the job, to the truth, to the people in his care. She thought about care and what it looked like when it was genuine rather than performed. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. She had been going to say something practical. She had organized a practical sentence on the way to the office. She looked at him across the desk, with the lamp lit between them, and the note he'd just made, and the 10 days of evidence she had been carefully accumulating, and the practical sentence went away. "Do you ever think about something other than this town?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the processing quiet, this was different, more careful. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about—" He looked at the desk for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I think about whether staying was the right choice," he said. "Not whether I should leave, I've settled that, but whether the reasons I had were good ones." He paused. "Lately I've been thinking the reasons were better than I knew when I made the decision." She held his gaze. The lamp between them was steady. The office was quiet. Outside Dust Hollow was doing its evening things, someone at the saloon, a horse being walked down the main street, the ordinary percussion of a small town settling into night. "I told you something about Abilene," she said. "I told you everything about it." "Yes," he said. "I haven't told anyone else," she said. "Pearl doesn't know. Mrs. Haverford doesn't know. Carrie doesn't know you said he didn't need it for the legal question." "He doesn't," Ethan said. "But I told you," she said. "And I want you to know why." She looked at him with the directness that had been her default with him since the first night, and had become in 10 days not a choice she made, but simply the way she was when he was in the room. "Because I'm not building on half a foundation with you, whatever this is." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Whatever this is," he said, "is something I would like to be." "I know," she said. "So would I." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of something they had both just said, without using more words than were necessary. She stood up. "I'm going back to the boarding house," she said. "I'll walk you," he said. "You always do," she said. He got his hat. They walked. The main street of Dust Hollow at 8 in the evening had the thin scattered quality of a town between its working day and its sleeping one, and they walked through it side by side in the way they had developed, and she thought about what she had said, not building on half a foundation, and felt the truth of it, the way you feel the truth of something you have been building to without knowing it. He stopped at the boarding house door. He said, "Get some rest." "I always do now," she said. And it was true, she had been sleeping properly since the second night, which was something she had not done in Abilene in the last year she'd been there. She looked at him. "Ethan." He waited. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The wire to Carrie, the boardwalk at 7 in the morning, the room and the land and all the things you knew to do before I knew to ask for them." She paused. "I want you to know I see all of it." He held her gaze. "I know you do," he said. "That's part of why." She went inside. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed, and she did not think about Abilene, and she did not think about the stepfather or the arrangement or the dead man's name in the will or Hatch and Pruitt and their collapsing strategies. She thought about a man who had said, "That's part of why," and she thought about what why meant when it was attached to the things he had been doing for 10 days. And she thought about all the ways a person could be afraid of something they wanted, and all the ways that fear, when it finally moved. She was not afraid. That was the fact she sat with. She turned it over and examined it, and she was not afraid of Ethan Cole. She had been looking for the cost of him since the first evening, and she had been finding every day that the cost was what it looked like, nothing more. Nothing hidden, no angle working behind the generosity. She had not known a man like that was possible. She had 23 years of evidence against it. 10 days of Ethan Cole did not erase 23 years of evidence. She knew that. She kept knowing it even as she sat on the bed in the boarding house in the Colorado dark, and understood with a specificity that surprised her how much she wanted to trust him completely. She was going to be slow about it. She was going to let the 10 days become 30, and the 30 become more before she said anything or allowed anything that she couldn't take back. She had been cautious with him in the right ways, and she intended to keep being cautious in the right ways. She decided that. She was decided. 3 days later, the man from Abilene arrived. She didn't know he was there until she came out of the laundry at midday and found him standing on the boardwalk with the specific quality of a man who has positioned himself to be found. He was 40 thin, with the kind of face that had always been calculating and had done it long enough that the calculation had become the face. His name was Thomas Reeve. He had been her stepfather's lawyer, and his presence in Dust Hollow was, she understood immediately, not coincidental and not personal. He was here because someone had paid him to be here. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Reeve," she said. Her voice was even. She had not seen this man in 2 years, and in those 2 years she had moved twice and changed her plans entirely, and put 4 days of stage travel between herself and everything he represented. He was here anyway. That was what men like Hatch did. They reached. "Your stepfather sends his regards," Reeve said. "Tell him I am well and that there's nothing in Dust Hollow that involves him," she said. "He's concerned about the property matter," Reeve said. "The inheritance. He feels there may be some question about." "There's no question," Clara said. "The will is valid. The ownership is established. Robert Carey of Pueblo is the attorney of record. If your client has legal concerns, they go through Carey." Reeve's expression adjusted. He had expected she understood the woman who had left Abilene, careful compressed operating on $11.40, and the particular fragility of someone who has been managed down to their minimum for years. He had not prepared for this one. "Your stepfather believes the arrangement that sent you here may have created certain obligations." "The arrangement that sent me here," she said, "was informal, unwitnessed, and sent me to a man who died before I arrived. There are no obligations. There is no arrangement. There is only me on my land in my town." She looked at him directly. "Tell my stepfather I said good luck to him." She walked away. She walked to the sheriff's office because it was the right direction, and because she wanted to be moving, and because Ethan needed to know. He was at the desk. He looked at her face and stood up. She told him. She told him Reeve's name, what he'd said, what she'd said the entire exchange in under 2 minutes. He listened, and his face did something controlled and specific, the warmth going out of it, in the way that happened when he was assessing a threat rather than a situation. "He'll go to Hatch," Ethan said. "Of course," she said. "That's why he's here. Hatch funded the trip." "How do you know that?" "Because my stepfather doesn't fund anything himself if he can find someone else to pay for it," she said. "And because Hatch needs something I have, and Reeve's presence here is not an accident." She sat down. "What does my stepfather actually have? If Reeve goes to Hatch and they construct something together, what's the strongest version of it?" Ethan sat back down. "The strongest version is a claim that you were sent here under a formal arrangement that constituted a binding contract, and that the property you inherited was acquired under false pretenses because you misrepresented your status." He looked at her. "It's thin. It requires establishing that the arrangement was formal, which it wasn't, and that you misrepresented anything which you didn't. But it could delay things. It could create enough noise that Hatch gets a court date. How long would delay cost me? Carrie's documentation files next week, he said. Once it files, the title is recorded under your name in the territorial court. Delay after that costs Hatch money, not you. He looked at her. The question is, what happens in the next 5 days? What do you think happens? I think Reeve talks to Hatch tonight, Ethan said. I think Hatch decides whether Reeve is useful enough to pay further or whether he's a dead end. If Hatch is smart, he paused. Hatch is smart. He'll recognize that what Reeve has isn't enough to win. He'll cut his losses. And if he's not ready to cut his losses, then he files something frivolous, and it costs him more than it costs you, and Carrie buries it in 2 weeks, Ethan said. Either way, you're positioned. She looked at him. She thought about 5 days. She thought about Reeve going to Hatch and the night's worth of calculation that would follow, and the morning's decision. She thought about the specific vulnerability of being in the right position legally and still being susceptible to the noise. There's something I want to ask you, she said. Ask, he said. She looked at him directly. If Hatch does file something even frivolous, it's going to be in connection with my name and my history and the story of how I got here. It's going to be public. She paused. People in this town are still deciding what they think of me. I've been here less than 2 weeks. If there's a court filing with my stepfather's name in it and the story of the arrangement and all of it, it won't change what people in this town think of you, Ethan said. How can you be sure of that? Because the people in this town who matter have already decided, he said. Mrs. Haverford, Pearl, Marta Schultz, Jim Harmon, Walt Kettles. He held her gaze. And me. We decided in the first week. Nothing Hatch files changes that. She looked at him. She thought about the evidence she had been accumulating, about what verified meant when you had enough of it. She said, Ethan, I want to ask you something I have no right to ask yet. He waited. If this gets worse before it gets better, she said, I want to know that you're still going to be here. Not as the sheriff. As... She stopped. She was not a woman who left sentences unfinished, but she had never had occasion to finish this particular kind of sentence before. As whatever you are to me, she said. He looked at her across the desk in the lamplight for a long moment. He said, That question has already been answered. Say it anyway, she said. I want to hear it. I'm here, he said. Whatever comes. That's not conditional on the Hatch situation, or the Reeve situation, or anything that comes out of Abilene. I'm here because I chose to be, and I don't unmake choices because they get complicated. He held her gaze. You should know by now that that's how I work. She did know. That was the thing she knew. She had 10 days of knowing, and the knowing was solid in a way she had never let herself have before, because she had not understood until now that solid was an option. She said, All right. She said it simply without elaboration, the way he said things, as a statement of position complete in itself. He understood. She saw him understand. That night Reeve was at the Silver Dollar Saloon. She knew because Pearl told her, Pearl being a woman of extraordinary information-gathering capacity, that had surprised Clara less each day as she understood Pearl better. Reeve was at the saloon, and Hatch was at the saloon, and they were at the same table, and they talked for 2 hours. She did not go near the saloon. She went to bed. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something on the main street too loud for the hour, too purposeful. She listened. She heard voices, one of them raised, and then nothing, and then boots on the boardwalk, and then silence. She dressed and went to the window. The main street was empty. No, not empty. Ethan was there outside the saloon talking to a man she couldn't see clearly. They talked for 2 minutes. Then the other man went inside, and Ethan stood there alone for a moment, and then he looked up. He couldn't have seen her at the window in the dark. But he looked up. She stayed at the window until he walked back toward the office. Then she went back to bed and lay in the dark and thought about what it meant that her first instinct when she'd heard the noise was not fear, but the specific orientation of a woman who wants to know where one particular person is. She knew where he was. He was handling it. She slept. In the morning, she went to find him before the laundry. He was at the office desk. He looked like he had not slept, which was confirmed by the second coffee cup and the not quite completeness of his morning grooming. "Reeve left on the first stage," he said. 5 o'clock this morning. She stared. "Already?" "Hatch told him he wasn't useful," Ethan said. "I know that because Hatch told me directly. At 2:30 this morning at my office, which is what the noise was." He looked at her. "Hatch came to tell me he was withdrawing his claim on the parcel." The room was very still. "He's withdrawing. He said the legal costs were not proportionate to the likely outcome," Ethan said. He said this in the way of a man who has done arithmetic and found it unpersuasive. He picked up his coffee. He also said he expected to do business in this county for a long time, and that he understood the sheriff's office had long memory. "You told him that?" "I reminded him of it," Ethan said. She looked at him. She looked at the second coffee cup, and the not quite grooming, and the 2:30 meeting with Hatch, and the 5 o'clock stage, and she thought about all the things she had not been awake to see this man doing on her behalf. "You've been up all night," she said. "Most of it," he said. "Why didn't you come tell me when it happened?" "It was 3 in the morning," he said. "You needed the sleep. It kept until morning." She looked at him. She was going to say something practical. She had a practical thing prepared. She looked at him with his second coffee, and his night awake, and the withdrawn claim, and the gone lawyer, and the particular quality of a man who did what needed doing, and then waited until morning to tell anyone about it, because the person who needed to know needed the sleep more. She crossed the office, and she did something she had not planned and had not organized in advance, and had no sentence prepared for. She put her hand on his face. Just for a moment. Just her palm against his jaw, brief and deliberate, the way you touch something, to confirm it's real. He went very still. She stepped back. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her. His face had an expression she had not seen before, not the settling, not the warmth, not the controlled assessment. Something more exposed than any of those. Something that had come up because she had done something he hadn't expected, and he hadn't had time to manage it back down. She was glad she'd seen it. She filed it in the same place she kept everything about him. "Go sleep," she said. "I can get to the laundry on my own this morning." "I know you can," he said. "Then go," she said. He went. She walked to the laundry. She pressed shirts for 4 hours with the steady grounded focus of a woman who has just watched the last active threat to her position dissolve and has understood in the same moment that what she has built in 13 days in this town is not temporary and is not provisional and is not something she is going to lose because she is afraid to hold it. The 40 acres were hers. The water leases were signed. The lawyer was filing. Hatch was done. And Ethan Cole had put his hand against a pillow at 5 in the morning so she could sleep, and she had put her hand on his face, and neither of them had made it into more than it was or less than it was. She pressed the 4th shirt. She thought about what less than it was would mean and decided she was done being less about things that were more. She was done. She finished the shirt. She started the next one. She thought about what more looked like when you had never let yourself have it. And she thought it probably looked exactly like this, ordinary and specific, and building toward something you could feel coming the way you felt. Whether not yet arrived, but no longer in any doubt. She let it come. Ethan slept until noon and came to find her at the laundry at 1 o'clock, which she knew because Marta looked through the front window and said without turning around, "Your sheriff is back." "He's not my sheriff," Clara said. Said Marta, which was the same sound she had made 2 weeks ago about him standing outside and meant exactly the same thing. He was standing at the front of the laundry with a cup of coffee she suspected he'd brought himself, and the specific quality of a man who had slept 4 hours and was operating on the functional side of that. She came to the door and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about the morning, which was exactly right, because the morning had been said already. "Carrie's documents filed," he said. "I got the confirmation wire an hour ago. She let that land. The territorial court record. Her name on 40 acres, permanent and official, and no longer provisional." "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She went back to work. He stayed on the boardwalk for 20 minutes and then went back to the office. And that was the shape of the afternoon. The ordinary Tuesday shape of two people living in the same town who had agreed on something without yet saying what they'd agreed on. She was learning patience. Not the compressed, held-breath patience of a woman waiting for the next bad thing, but the patient quality of someone who knew where they were going and trusted the pace of getting there. The week finished. The following week began. On Wednesday morning, Dust Hollow's schoolteacher, a woman named Agnes Vane, fell on the ice outside the church and broke her wrist. It was a clean break. The doctor said she would recover fully, but she would be unable to write for 6 weeks, which meant she could not teach, which meant the 12 children in Silver Creek's one-room schoolhouse had nowhere to be for 6 weeks, and their parents had strong feelings about that. Clara heard about it at the laundry from a woman who came in for her husband's shirts and was audibly agitated about the situation. Clara pressed the shirts. She thought about the agitation. She thought about 12 children and 6 weeks and the specific arithmetic of a town that needed something and had a person who could provide it. She had been a school teacher before Abilene, before the stepfather, before any of it. She had taught for 2 years in a small Missouri town where she'd been hired at 19, and had been by every account, including her own honest assessment, good at it. She had stopped when the stepfather's household made leaving every morning difficult enough that continuing became impossible. But the knowledge hadn't left. Knowledge didn't leave. She went to see Agnes Vane that evening. Agnes was at home with her wrist in a splint, and the particular expression of a woman who is in pain and more worried about her classroom than her injury. She looked at Clara with the assessing eye of an educator evaluating an unknown quantity and said, "You were a teacher." 2 years, Clara said. "Missouri, ages 6 through 14. "What readers do you use?" "I've worked with McGuffey," Clara said, "but I'll use whatever your students are accustomed to." Agnes looked at her for another moment. "The parents need to approve," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I'd like to meet with them if you can arrange it." "Tomorrow evening," Agnes said. 7 o'clock, here." Clara arrived at 7. There were 9 parents. They looked at her with the collective expression of people who had made up their minds to be skeptical and were prepared to be persuaded by evidence. She told them her experience. She told them what she expected from students and what they could expect from her. She answered questions for 45 minutes. At the end, a woman named Helen Garrett, who had the informal authority of someone who had been in the town longest and was therefore implicitly trusted to make assessments, said, "The Whitmore woman, you're the one with Beecham's land." "Yes," Clara said. "You've been here 3 weeks." 20 days, Clara said. Helen looked at her. "You walked into a meeting with Hatch and his lawyer and didn't move an inch." She said it like a woman who had been told this and had found it notable. Agnes Vane doesn't move an inch either, which is why she's been teaching here for 4 years. She looked at the other parents. "I'm satisfied." The other parents were satisfied. She started teaching Monday morning. The first day she stood at the front of Agnes Vane's classroom and looked at 12 faces ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and felt for the first time since she'd arrived in Dust Hollow entirely sure of where she was. This was something she knew. This was territory she could read as fast as it moved, and faster than it changed, and the specific clarity of standing in your competence was something she had been missing without knowing it. She taught. The children were the way children were everywhere, some quick, some struggling, some performing indifference to cover anxiety. She could read all of them by noon of the first day, and she had adjusted her approach by the afternoon session without making it visible, which was the primary skill of teaching, and the one that took the longest to develop. She walked home at 4 o'clock with the particular tiredness that was not depletion, but used the tiredness of having spent yourself on something worth spending on. She was thinking about tomorrow's lesson plan when she nearly walked into Pearl on the boardwalk. Pearl said without preamble. Ethan's been in front of the schoolhouse every morning this week. Clara stopped. What do you mean in front? I mean at 8 o'clock when the children start arriving, Pearl said. He comes and stands there for 15 minutes and makes sure the morning is orderly and then goes. She looked at Clara. He also did it yesterday when you had your meeting with the parents. He stood outside Agnes's house for 2 hours. Clara stood on the boardwalk. She thought about Ethan and the 7 o'clock boardwalk in front of the laundry. She thought about him standing outside the hotel during the Hatch meeting. She thought about 2:30 in the morning and the withdrawn claim and the 5 o'clock stage. She thought about a man who showed up in front of places where she was without announcing it and without wanting anything for it. He thinks I don't know, she said. He knows you know, Pearl said. He just doesn't do it to be seen. He does it because he can't do otherwise. She looked at Clara with the expression she had been using for 3 weeks, the one that had already arrived at conclusions Clara was still working toward. You know what he is? I know what he is, Clara said. She went to find him that evening. He was at the office desk, which was where he always was. In the early evening, the day's paperwork, the day's records, the work that didn't stop because the sun went down. He looked up when she came in, and she sat down across from him, and she said without leading up to it, You've been standing outside the schoolhouse in the mornings. He didn't look away. Yes? And outside Agnes Vane's house during the parent meeting. Yes? You weren't going to tell me. I wasn't keeping it from you, he said. I just didn't mention it. Those aren't the same thing, she said. And she heard herself use the phrase the one he had used with her about Abilene weeks ago, and she saw him hear it too. Fair, he said. You're right. He looked at her steadily. I didn't want it to feel like surveillance. It isn't. It's... He stopped. He started again, which was unusual. He was not a man who started sentences twice. It's that I want to know you're all right, he said. And standing somewhere I can see that is easier than not knowing. She looked at him. She thought about 20 days of this man. About all the ways he had shown up without making a performance of showing up. About the specific, consistent quality of being cared for by someone who did not require anything in return for the caring. I'm going to say something, she said. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. He put the pen down. He waited. I came to Dust Hollow afraid, she said. Not just of the night or the marriage or the man I'd never met. Afraid in a way I'd been afraid for years, the kind of afraid where you stop expecting anything to be different, and you just manage what's in front of you, and you call that living. She held his gaze. I have not been afraid since day 3. Since you sat across from me at Mrs. Haverford's table and took your hat off and told me where the sheriff's office was and asked for nothing in exchange. She paused. I want you to understand what that means. What 3 weeks without the fear feels like after years with it. Ethan was very still. I'm not saying this to thank you, she said. I'm saying it because I want you to know the full picture. The same way I told you about Abilene. She looked at him. You asked me last week what I wanted. And I told you I wanted to know you'd still be here. But that wasn't the whole answer. What's the whole answer? He said. His voice was careful but not managed, the careful of a man paying complete attention. The whole answer is that I want to build something here, she said. Not just the land and the lease agreements and the teaching. I want to build a life here, a real one. She kept his gaze. And I want to know whether that's something you want too. Not as a hypothetical, as a decision. The room was quiet for a long moment. Clara, he said. Yes. I made that decision 3 weeks ago, he said. On the second evening, when you walked into the boarding house supper and sat down across from me and asked if you could call me Ethan, and then went back to the laundry, and I sat in this office and thought about the fact that a woman had arrived in this town with nothing and had started building something before she'd been here 48 hours. He held her gaze. I decided then. I've been deciding every day since. She breathed. She was steady. She had not been sure she would be steady for this conversation, and she was, which told her something important about how right the decision was. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right what? "All right, build it with me," she said. The silence after that had a quality she had never heard in a silence before. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something arriving that had been on its way for 3 weeks and had finally gotten here. He stood up. She stood up. They were on the same side of the desk for the first time, which was a small physical fact that was not a small anything. He said, "I'm going to ask you something." She waited. "Not tonight," he said, "but soon. I want to ask you properly, with time for you to think about it." He looked at her with everything in his face that he usually held back. "I want you to know it's coming, so it doesn't arrive before you're ready." She understood. He was warning her the way he had warned her about every other thing that was coming, giving her time to prepare, to think, to decide on her own terms before anyone else's timing forced her hand. Even in this, the most personal thing, he was giving her the option. "I'll be ready," she said. "I know," he said, "but I'll give you the time anyway." She walked back to the boarding house. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed and she thought about being ready and what it meant that she already was. And she thought about a man who was going to ask her properly and give her time anyway. Because that was how he did things, with more care than the situation required. Because he had decided the situation deserved more care than was required. She thought about what she had been afraid of when she stepped off that stagecoach. She thought about what she was not afraid of now. She thought about the night she had rehearsed for 4 days on the road and the night she had actually had Mrs. Haverford's supper table, Pearl's practical information, a lamp in a boarding house room, and the specific shock of feeling for the first time in years like a person with possibilities. She thought about how far 20 days was from where she'd started. He asked her on a Saturday. He had told Marta, apparently, because Marta let her go an hour early without explanation. He had told Mrs. Haverford because Mrs. Haverford pressed the good dress on her Friday evening without comment. He had told Pearl because Pearl appeared at the boarding house Saturday morning, looked at Clara's hair and said, "Sit down," and did something with it that was considerably better than what Clara would have done herself. She walked out into the November morning knowing what was coming, and knowing that knowing didn't diminish it. He was waiting at the north edge of town at the boundary of the parcel she owned, which she understood was deliberate. He had chosen the land, her land, the thing she had built her position on as the place for this. He was standing with his hat in his hands. He looked at her when she arrived and he said, "You look different." "Pearl did something to my hair," she said. "That's not what I meant," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. He looked out at the land for a moment. Then he looked at her. He didn't preamble. He had never preambled anything. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build a life with you in this town that you chose to stay in. I want to stand next to you for every legal negotiation and every parent meeting and every early morning. I want to be the person you tell things to when you've just found them out." He held her gaze. "And I want you to want that for yourself, not because you need someone to stand beside you, because you've shown me you don't, but because you choose to." She looked at him. She looked at the land behind him, her land 40 acres with water rights and lease agreements and 2 handshakes from men who respected the fair rate. She thought about what choose meant when you had been choosing for yourself for 23 days, and had learned in those days what choosing actually felt like, as opposed to what it had been masquerading as before. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He didn't move toward her. He held out his hand, an offering, not an assumption, and she took it, and they stood at the edge of her land in the November air, and the cold was sharp and specific, and she felt it fully the same way she had been feeling everything fully since she stopped pressing things down. She was fully in it, all of it. They were married 2 weeks later. The ceremony was in the church with the new steeple, which had been replaced the previous spring. Mrs. Haverford and Pearl and Marta Schultz were there. Jim Harmon and Walt Kettles came in from the north, which she had not expected, and which moved her in a way she chose not to suppress. Agnes Vane came with her wrist still in the splint and watched with the expression of a woman who recognized a good decision. The minister read the words. Ethan said yes. Clara said yes. It was in the ways that counted, the simplest thing she had done in 23 years. On the walk from the church, Pearl said quietly, "How does it feel?" Clara thought about it honestly. "Like something I did for myself," she said. "Not to escape something or fulfill something or satisfy something. Just for myself." Pearl squeezed her hand. Mrs. Haverford had arranged a supper. It was practical and genuine and entirely without pretension, which was exactly what Clara had become accustomed to in this town that had not planned to be hers and was. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone and the boarding house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with Ethan across from her. They would move into the house he had been renting at the west end of town in the morning. But tonight was the boarding house, and they drank the last of the coffee Mrs. Haverford had left out. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said. He thought about it. "I was afraid of horses until I was 12, he said. She stared. "You ride every day." "That's why I'm not afraid anymore," he said. "Your turn." She thought about it. "I used to be afraid of the dark," she said. "Until I was 16. And then something happened that was worse than the dark, and after that the dark seemed manageable." He looked at her. He didn't ask what the something was. He knew she would tell him if and when she chose to, and the not asking was the same respect he brought to everything that was hers to hold until she decided otherwise. "One more," she said. "One more what?" "Something I don't know." He looked at her across the table. He said, "When you touched my face that morning after Hatch, I had to sit in that office for 20 minutes before I could work again." She felt that. She felt it precisely. "Why?" "Because nobody had ever touched me like that," he said. "Like I was something worth confirming." She held his gaze. "You are," she said. He held hers. "So are you," he said. She picked up her coffee. She thought about the stagecoach. She thought about the 4-day rehearsal of a fear that had never arrived. She thought about $11.40 and a dead man's name and the specific shock of her own name in a will she hadn't known existed. She thought about all the ways a life could take a turn so complete that nothing you packed for the previous version applied. "Ethan," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you something about that night," she said. "The first night, what I was afraid of." He waited. He always waited. She told him. She told him the full shape of it. Not the abstract fear of the unknown, but the specific fear she had carried through 4 days on the stagecoach and through every calculation she had made about Harold Beecham, and what a marriage to a stranger meant about the night it began, and what she had understood from her life about what men believed they were owed when a woman arrived as part of an arrangement. She told him clearly and without softening it, because she had decided that if this was the life she was building it on full information from the beginning. When she finished, he was quiet for the 5 seconds he always took. Then he said, "I want to tell you something about tonight." She waited. "Nothing happens tonight," he said, "unless you choose it. Not tonight. Not any night. You tell me what you want when you want it, and that's what we do. That's how this works." He held her gaze across the table. "Your life is yours. I'm part of it because you chose to let me be. Not because of what a marriage means about entitlement. Because you chose." She looked at him. She thought about the word chose and what it meant to have it applied specifically to her. Her life. Her choice. Her body, her heart, her decisions hers, not forfeited at the church door, not part of the arrangement. She had known he would say something like this. She had been collecting evidence for 37 days, and she had known. But hearing it said directly, plainly, without decoration in his voice, was different from knowing it was coming. "Ethan," she said. "Yes?" "I know what I want," she said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him without any management or armor or compression. Just directly the way she looked at everything she had decided to keep. "I want you. On my terms, in my time, which is right now." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you, because you told me to tell you what I want." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Are you sure? I'm choosing?" she said. That's what sure looks like. He stood. He came around the table and held out his hand, not claiming, not assuming offering. She took it. She stood. They went upstairs in Mrs. Haverford's boarding house on the last night it would be her boarding house, and what happened between them was not what she had spent 4 days on a stagecoach rehearsing. It was nothing like fear. It was nothing like the compressed, managed version of living she had been doing for years. It was a choice made freely held, gently returned, with the specific care of a man who had learned that the most important thing about a person was the thing they'd chosen to give you, and not the thing you could take. She lay in the dark afterward, and she was not afraid of the dark, and she was not afraid of anything, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 37 days ago, with her bag and her arithmetic, and her rehearsed terror, and she thought that woman would not recognize this moment. That was not a sad thought. That was the best thought she had ever had. She fell asleep with her hand in his. She did not let go even in sleep. She would not know that until morning, and in the morning she would feel it. Her hand in his, both of them loose in sleep, held without gripping, and she would lie there for 10 minutes before she moved just to feel the full specific weight of what it was to be present in a life that was completely and without reservation hers. The teaching continued. Agnes Vane's wrist healed in 6 weeks, but the parents at a meeting Clara did not attend voted to ask her to continue. Agnes herself came to find her at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "They want you to stay, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Clara said. Agnes looked at the classroom, at the lessons Clara had written on the board, at the way the desks were arranged, at the small things that told an experienced teacher what kind of teacher she was looking at. "You're good at this," she said. "I know," Clara said. Agnes smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had said exactly that about herself for years, and had never had another woman confirm it with the same unapologetic directness. "Good," she said. "The town needs both of us." Clara looked at her class. She thought about the 12 faces she could read in 90 seconds now. She thought about the specific work of helping a person understand something they hadn't understood before, the particular satisfaction of watching something come clear in a face that had been clouded. She had built something here. She had built several things here. A teaching position. A landholding with fair leases to honest neighbors. A network of women who had decided she was worth knowing. A marriage to a man who had shown her 37 days at a time what it looked like when someone chose to be present without requiring anything back. She was 37 days and a life away from the stagecoach. She went home that evening to the house at the west end of town that she had filled in 2 weeks of occupying it with the specific imprint of a woman making a space hers. The small reorganizations, the particular morning light she had identified and arranged toward the kitchen where she made coffee at a time that was hers to choose. Ethan was at the table when she came in. He looked up. He said, "Good day." "Agnes Vane wants me to keep teaching," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard." "Did you hear before or after I did?" "This morning," he admitted. "She asked what I thought." "What did you say?" "I said it was entirely your decision, and she should ask you," he said. "And I said I'd never seen you do anything you weren't exceptional at." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him across the room. She thought about all the things this man had said to her and about her in 37 days. The running total of it. The specific, patient, consistent weight of being believed in by someone who had nothing to gain from the believing. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "I want you to know that specifically, not as a general statement. I mean the specific thing I was afraid of when I got off that stagecoach. I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of this house or this life or what I've chosen." She held his gaze. "I want you to know because you're the reason. Not the only reason I've done the work too, I know that. But you're the reason I had the space to do it." He held her gaze for a long moment. He said, "Clara." "Yes." "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it all the way through," he said. She waited. "You did not come here afraid and leave unafraid because of me," he said. You came here afraid and chose every single day to stay anyway. To act anyway. To walk into meetings and take on teaching positions and put your name on leases and stand in front of Hatch's lawyer without moving an inch. He looked at her steadily. I stood on boardwalks. You walked through doors. Those are not the same thing. She looked at him. She thought about what it meant to be with someone who refused to take credit for what you'd done, who saw the full picture, including the parts where he wasn't in it. You're right, she said. I know, he said. And there was something in his face that contained warmth, the almost smile she had been watching for a month, that was more than an almost now. It was a full, real, unheld thing. She went and sat across from him at the table. She put her hands on the surface between them. He covered them with his. They sat in the house that was theirs in the town she had chosen, and outside Dust Hollow continued its evening, and the lamp made its warm circle, and the life she had built from a single stagecoach arrival, and $11.40, and the name of a dead man in a will she hadn't known existed, held itself around them solid and specific and permanently, irrevocably hers. She was not afraid. She was not surviving. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, and the choosing had made all the difference, and she held it without gripping the way she had learned to hold everything that was real, openly, completely with both hands and no armor, and the full specific presence of a woman who had stopped pressing things down and had found on the other side of that, stopping everything worth having. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 4 months after the wedding. Clara was at the schoolhouse when Ethan brought it. She knew from the way he came through the door the specific quality of his arrival controlled, but carrying something that it was not ordinary mail. He waited until the children had gone to their noon break before he said anything, and then he held the envelope out and said, "It's from Abilene." She took it. She looked at the handwriting on the front and recognized it, and felt in the space of 2 seconds the full return of something she thought she had finished with, not fear, not anymore, but the specific cold alertness of a woman who knows a threat by its handwriting. It was from her stepfather. Not his lawyer this time. Him. She opened it. She read it standing at Agnes Vane's desk, with Ethan 4 feet away, and the noon quiet around them. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph established that he had heard about the land and the marriage and the teaching position in Dust Hollow, which meant he had continued gathering information after Reeve left. The second paragraph said he had retained new legal counsel and was prepared to file a claim asserting that the informal marriage arrangement had created a binding contract under Missouri law, and that as her legal guardian at the time of the arrangement, she had been 22, not 23 when the letter was sent. He had standing to contest both the arrangement's dissolution and the resulting inheritance. She stopped at that. She read the second paragraph again. 22. She had been 22 when the letter from Beecham arrived. She had turned 23 6 weeks before she stepped off the stagecoach. But the arrangement had been made when she was 22. The third paragraph told her what he wanted. Not the land. Not money. He wanted her to sign a letter acknowledging that the Dust Hollow arrangement had been entered into under his guardianship, and that any property acquired as a result was subject to guardianship oversight. It was not a legal document. It was a lever. If she signed it, she handed him the basis for a continuous claim on everything she built indefinitely. She folded the letter. She looked at Ethan. "He's been planning this since Reeve left," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "You've seen this before." "Not this exactly," he said, "but this shape. Men who don't have a legal position constructing one out of language rather than law." He held her gaze. "The guardian claim is the weakest part. You turned 23 before you arrived here. The arrangement was made when you were 22, but not executed. Beecham died before it was executed. An unexecuted arrangement with a deceased party made when you were under guardianship, but not honored until after you were of age. No court will hold that." She thought through the logic. She followed it the way she followed everything difficult completely to the end, without stopping at the parts that were uncomfortable. "He's not expecting a court to hold it," she said. "He's expecting me to not want the fight." "Yes," Ethan said. She stood with the letter in her hand and thought about what her stepfather knew about her. He knew she had left Abilene with $11.40 and a letter from a man she'd never met. He knew she had been managing other people's conditions for 6 years and had gotten very good at the efficiency of compliance. He knew, or he had known, 4 months ago, the shape of a woman who chose the path of least resistance, because least resistance was what kept her fed and housed. He did not know the woman who had walked into a hotel meeting with Hatch and his lawyer and not moved an inch. He did not know the woman who had stood at the edge of 40 acres and said, "Build it with me." "I'm not signing anything," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "I want to write to Carrie today." "I already sent a wire this morning," he said. "Before I brought you the letter." She looked at him. He had read the postmark and the handwriting and sent the wire before she knew the letter existed. She thought about this being the shape of her life now, not a man who managed things for her, but one who moved at the same speed she moved, sometimes slightly ahead, because he had learned her pace and matched it. "What did you tell him?" she said. "The situation, the origin, the guardianship argument." He paused. "And I asked him to look at one specific thing." "What thing?" "Whether the informal arrangement your stepfather made with Beecham constitutes a contract at all," he said. "Given that your stepfather was not your legal guardian at the time of your departure. You were 23 when you boarded the stage. Guardianship in Missouri ends at majority. If the arrangement was made when you were 22, but you departed at 23, his guardianship claim is not just weak, it's expired." She stared at him. She thought about the timeline. She thought about the dates. She had turned 23 on the 14th of September. The letter from Beecham had arrived in late August. She had left Abilene on the 3rd of October, 3 weeks after her birthday. "He knows that," she said slowly. "He's hoping you don't," Ethan said. She thought about the second paragraph again. He had said she was 22 when the arrangement was made, which was true. He had not said she was 22 when she left, because she hadn't been, because the fact that mattered was the date of departure, not the date of the letter. "He's lying about the relevant date," she said. "He's obscuring it," Ethan said. "Which is what men like him do. They tell the parts that serve them and leave out the parts that don't." She put the letter in her coat pocket. She looked at the empty schoolhouse. The children would be back in 20 minutes. She thought about 12 faces she could read in 90 seconds, and Agnes Vane's wrist, and Helen Garrett saying not an inch. And she thought about all of it, the whole 4 months of it, built on a foundation her stepfather had just tried to reach beneath and pull out. He had reached from Abilene into a life she had built in Dust Hollow and tried to pull the foundation out. She felt something that was not fear and not anger, exactly. Something colder and more focused than anger. The specific clarity of a woman who has identified a threat completely and is now only interested in the most effective response. "I want to write the response myself," she said. "Before Carrie files anything. I want him to hear from me first." Ethan looked at her. "What are you going to say?" "I'm going to tell him the relevant date," she said. "And I'm going to tell him that Carrie's office has been notified and that any further correspondence should go through Carrie and not to me directly." She paused. "And I'm going to tell him that I know exactly what he obscured in that second paragraph, and that he should understand that I am not the woman who left Abilene." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to read it before you send it?" "No," she said. "I'll tell you what I wrote after." He nodded. The children came back from noon break. She went back to teaching. She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table, while Ethan read at the other end. She wrote it in 3 drafts. The first one had too much heat. The second was too formal. The third was exactly right. Precise, complete, without a single word that could be used against her. She told him the date she had turned 23. She told him the date she had left Abilene. She told him that guardianship had been expired for 3 weeks before the arrangement was executed in any form. She told him that Carrie had been notified. She told him that further correspondence should go through Carrie's office. And in the final paragraph, in the same plain directness she had developed in the last 4 months of learning how she spoke, when she spoke for herself, she told him she was not writing to negotiate. She was writing to close the door. The door she wrote was now closed. She folded it. She sealed it. She set it on the table. Ethan looked up from his reading. She said, "I told him the door was closed." He looked at her. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "It has been for a while. I just needed to say it out loud." He looked at the expression she had been watching develop since the almost smile on day 10. Something open and warm and completely without management. "Good," he said. "Just that." She sent the letter Wednesday morning. Carrie's response came Friday. The guardianship claim had no standing. The relevant date was the date of departure. The stepfather's position was legally incoherent. Carrie would send a formal notification to the stepfather's new counsel within the week. Clara read the letter and filed it in the folder she kept with the will and the lease agreements, and the teaching contract, and all the other documents that made up the paper architecture of the life she had built. She added the copy of her own letter to the folder. She closed it. She did not hear from her stepfather again. The spring came fast that year. The children at the schoolhouse moved through their readers with the particular energy of students who had been taught by someone who believed what they were teaching mattered, which it turned out made a significant difference. Helen Garrett's daughter, who had been struggling with her numbers since the fall, came to Clara on a Thursday afternoon and worked a problem she had not been able to solve the week before, and the expression on her face when it came clear was something Clara had been watching for the specific brightness of a mind that has just understood something it thought was beyond it. She stood at the front of the classroom and thought, "This is what I'm for. Not the land, not the legal victories, not the letters that closed doors. Those were the work of survival and the work of justice, and both had been necessary, and she had done them well. But this was the work of building. This was what happened when the survival was handled and the justice was established and a person could move all the way to the question of what they were actually here to do. She was here to teach. She had always been here to teach. It had taken a 4-day stagecoach ride to a dead man's town to find out. She told Ethan that evening. He listened the way he always listened completely. When she finished, he said, "You've known for a while." "I've known since the first Monday," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it yet." "Why not?" She thought about it honestly. "Because saying what you're for means you've stopped thinking of yourself as temporary," she said. "And I was temporary for a long time, everywhere I was." She looked at him. "I'm not temporary anymore." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "You're not." June brought Jim Harmon to the school. He came at the end of a school day, hat in hand, in the way of a man who had been thinking about something long enough that he had decided to say it, even though saying it was uncomfortable. He looked at Clara and said, "I have something to tell you that I should have told you before." She waited. "Harold Beecham," he said. "The last time I saw him, he told me about you. Not your name, you weren't in contact yet. He told me there was a woman coming who had been in a hard situation for a long time, and who needed a place to land that was real." He paused. He said he didn't know if he'd be alive when she arrived. He'd been sick a longer time than he told anyone. He looked at her steadily. He said if he wasn't here, he hoped someone would make sure she wasn't left to manage it alone. Clara held very still. "He asked me specifically," Harmon said. "I told him yes, and then he died before I could do anything. And then you arrived and you had Ethan and Carrie, and it was clear you didn't need me to do anything, and I—" He stopped. "I should have told you sooner." She looked at this man 60 years old, honest, standing in a schoolroom with his hat in his hands, because he had been carrying a small guilt for 5 months, and had decided today was the day to put it down. She thought about Harold Beecham. She had been thinking about him intermittently since she arrived, the name in the will, the thing Walt Kettles had said, the way Ethan had described him. She had been building a picture of a man she had never met, who had known enough about her situation to build her a landing place before he died. She said, "Did he tell you anything else about her?" The woman who was coming, Harmon thought. He said she'd been managed down for a long time, that the right thing was not to manage her further, but to give her room. He paused. He said the land would do that if she had the chance to figure out what it was. Clara looked at the classroom. at the desks and the readers and the board where she'd written tomorrow's lesson, at the window that faced the street where she walked every morning from the house she shared with Ethan, at the particular specific shape of a life that a dead man had thought to make possible for a woman he'd never met. "He was a good man," she said. "The best I knew," Harmon said. She went home that evening and told Ethan. He listened. He said, "I knew Beecham asked him. Harmon told me in the first week. I didn't tell you because—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were dealing with Hatch and Reeve, and the land and the teaching," he said. "And I thought the information would wait until it could be received properly." She looked at him. She thought about the conversation they'd had in the third week about telling each other things about not protecting each other from information by withholding it. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "You're right. I should have told you." "Yes?" she said. "I'm sorry," he said. She held his gaze. It was the first time he had apologized to her for something specific, and he said it the way he said everything, directly, without qualification, without building a case for the defense alongside the apology. Just, "I'm sorry." "I know you are," she said. "Don't do it again." "I won't," he said. She believed him. That was the thing about evidence when you had enough of it. Belief became not an act of faith, but an act of observation. She had 8 months of evidence. She believed him. The summer came, and the children were out of school. And she used the 2 months to do the thing Carrie had suggested she consider since February. She rode the north parcel in full every acre, not with Ethan but alone, which was deliberate. She needed to know it herself, in her own time, without the mediation of anyone else's knowledge. She found things she hadn't expected. A section of the flat ground that had been plowed and was still showing the structure of old furrows. It had been a kitchen garden once, not a farm. Someone had grown specific things there, small-scale and personal. She didn't know who. She thought about asking Harmon. She found the spring itself the origin of the water rights, the source of everything the North Valley depended on. She stood beside it and listened to it and thought about value and what it meant to sit on something essential. She thought about the difference between using essential things as leverage and using them as a reason to be fair. She had been fair. She had set fair rates and signed 5-year terms and shaken 2 honest men's hands. She was the source of something necessary, and she had not converted that into power. She had converted it into relationship. That felt right. It felt like the only version of herself she wanted to be. Ethan was on the porch when she rode back. He looked at her as she dismounted and he said, "Well." "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. "I want to do something with the flat section," she said. "The old kitchen garden." "What do you want to do?" "I want to grow something," she said. "I don't know what yet. Something that takes a few years." She looked at him. "Something that's still going when I'm not thinking about it anymore." He looked at her with an expression that had the warmth in it fully. Now not the almost smile, but the real one. Unheld, the one she had been watching develop across 8 months of evenings and walks and conversations. "All right," he said. "What do you need tea?" "Time," she said. "And someone to disagree with about what to plant." "I can do both of those," he said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the room that was hers, the chair she always sat in, and the window she had arranged toward, and the particular morning light that was different from any other morning light she had known. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been careful with for a long time, and have stopped needing to be careful about. She had stopped gripping. She had learned in 8 months how to hold something real without gripping it, how to carry it without bracing for the moment it would be taken. She had learned this slowly, practice by practice, the way all things worth knowing had to be learned. She had learned it here, in this house, with this man, in a town she had arrived at by accident, and had stayed in by choice, and had built a life inside of that, was by any honest measure more than she had thought she was allowed to want. The letter had come from a dead man's name in a will. The life had come from everything she had done since. September came. The school year resumed. On the first day back, Helen Garrett's daughter arrived early before the other children on purpose, which Clara understood immediately and set something on the desk. A small jar, preserves from the summer. "Mama made them," the girl said. "She said to give them to you." Clara looked at the jar. She thought about Helen Garrett, who had decided she was worth trusting in that parent meeting 9 months ago, on the basis of 2 minutes and the words, "I have been here 20 days." She thought about the network of decisions she had been building since she arrived, each one an extension of the one before, each one resting on the foundation of the ones that had come before. "Tell your mother thank you," Clara said. The girl nodded and went to her desk. The other children arrived. The school day began. Clara stood at the front of the room she had been teaching in for 9 months and looked at the 12 faces she knew as well as she knew anything, and she felt in the specific, unmanaged, completely uncompressed way she had been learning to feel things entirely in the right place. She was not afraid of this life. She had not been afraid of it for a long time. She thought about the stagecoach. She thought about the 4-day rehearsal. She thought about $11.40 and the word provisions spoken in a calculated tone, and the door she had closed in her stepfather's last letter, and all the doors before that, the ones that had seemed like walls, until she understood they were movable. She thought about Harold Beecham, who had never met her and had given her the chance to become this. She thought about Ethan Cole, who had told her what the room looked like, and had been standing in it with her ever since. At the end of the school day, she walked home the way she walked home every day, down the main street of Dust Hollow, past the place where the boarding house was, and the place where she had walked into the county clerk's office with Ethan 4 months after arriving, and before she understood what arriving meant. Past the sheriff's office, past the feed store where Aldous Pruitt had tried to open a door she had not walked through. She walked past all of it, and she felt none of the old compression. Not the managed, careful breathing of a woman waiting for the next difficulty, not the provisional quality of a life held at arm's length in case it was taken. She felt the specific, open quality of a person who has arrived somewhere and knows it, and does not need to keep checking whether she is still there. She was still there. She came home to the house at the west end of town. Ethan was on the porch. He had been waiting, not anxiously, not demonstratively, just present the way he was always present. He looked up when she came through the gate and said, "Good day." "Yes," she said. She sat down beside him on the porch in the specific way they sat together in the evenings, close, unhurried, with the accumulated ease of two people who have been honest with each other long enough that proximity was simply where they were. "Helen Garrett's daughter brought me preserves," she said. "That's from Helen," he said. "She mentioned it to me on Monday. You let me be surprised." "I thought you deserved it," he said. She looked at him. She thought about a man who withheld preserves so she could have a moment of genuine surprise because he had learned her well enough to know what she needed and when she needed it, and how to provide it without making it about himself. She reached over and took his hand. She held it the way she had learned to hold things, without gripping with the full specific weight of what it was. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I have been thinking about Harold Beecham," she said. "About what he did and why. About a man who built a landing place for a woman he'd never met because he understood she needed one." She looked at Ethan. "I've been thinking about whether I'm grateful to him." "Are you?" "I'm grateful for the land," she said. "I'm grateful for the will. I'm grateful for what it made possible." She paused. "But I've realized that what I'm most grateful for is not the thing he arranged. It's the thing that happened because of it." She met his eyes. "You. And everything I became here in this town, in this life. The teaching, the leases, the letters I didn't sign and the ones I wrote, the woman who walked into that hotel meeting." She held his gaze. "Harold Beecham gave me a landing place. What I did with it is mine. What you and I built from it is ours." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Yes, just that." The single word that was in his usage, as full as a page, complete without qualifier, meaning exactly and only what it said. She turned to look out at the street. At Dust Hollow going about its evening. at the specific ordinary beauty of a town that had not planned to be hers and was. She thought about the night she had been afraid of for 4 days on a stagecoach, the night she had arrived and found a dead man's name and an empty arrangement, and the specific cold terror of being a woman alone in a town that didn't protect women. She thought about what the night had actually been. Mrs. Haverford's supper, Pearl's practical information, a lamp in a boarding house room, a man with his hat in his hands telling her what the room looked like. She had been afraid of the wrong things. That was the thing she had been turning over for 9 months, not with regret, not with the wish that it had been different, but with the particular wonder of looking back at a turning point and understanding how completely the turn had changed the direction of travel. She had feared a night. She had gotten a life. She had arrived with nothing she had chosen, and had built from the raw material of accident and inheritance, and the specific stubborn courage of a woman who refused to sign things she hadn't agreed to a life that was entirely her own. The land was hers. The teaching was hers. The marriage was chosen, and the house was filled, and the kitchen garden on the flat section of the north parcel was going to grow something that took years, something that would be there when she stopped thinking about it, something that would outlast the moment of its planting. She was going to outlast the moment of her planting. She had already outlasted it. Clara Whitmore had stepped off a stagecoach in Dust Hollow with $11 and a dead man's name and the rehearsed shape of a fear she had been carrying for years, and she had stayed, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at what was here, the land, the people, the man who stood on boardwalks at 7 in the morning with nothing to gain from standing there, and she had chosen it. Chosen all of it with the full and unmanaged weight of a woman who had learned that choosing was what made a life real. She was real. This life was real. This love was the kind that didn't take the kind that waited, that stepped back, that asked what you wanted, and then gave you the time to know the answer, that stood on boardwalks and sat in offices and held your hand without gripping, and said simply and without decoration, "That's your house, that's your land, that's your life, yours entirely, completely without condition." That was what she had found on the other side of fear. Not safety, not rescue, not a man who saved her from the night she was afraid of. A life she had built herself with her own hands and her own decisions and her own plain-spoken refusal to be less than she was, and a man beside her who had never once asked her to be. That was the whole of it. That was everything. And it was without any reservation or qualification or managed reduction exactly enough.